Hi there, folks. Welcome to episode 12 of Nintendo Deep Dive. My name is Carl. I am the creator and host of this podcast. To the uninitiated, Nintendo Deep Dive is a retrospective-focused Nintendo show, all about retro Nintendo games and retro Nintendo machines, often featuring retrospective reviews. On the docket for today, a quick game check-in, followed by a review of Mischief makers, with a ranking section to close out the show. So, let's dive right into game check-in. I want to talk a little more about Pikmin, even though I have spoken plenty about it already on the channel. Of course, I played it hot on the heels of Pikmin 4, which, as some of you might know, I may have low-key hated. And thus Pikmin was probably showing in a more favorable light than it might otherwise have. Flattering comparison or not, Pikmin is a very good game, despite the fact that its very fundamental player programming feels on the verge of falling apart, or has already fallen apart. Despite that, a great concept, compelling structure and design, a good driving gameplay loop, charming audio visuals that mask the game's savagery. Overall, a unique adventure that quits while it's ahead, but still leaves the door open for more, should one desire. Not the first time I have played Pikmin, but even so, it was a breath of fresh air after months of playing games I did not enjoy all that much. The most standout thing about Pikmin this go-around was the aesthetics. I was of the mind that the naturalistic art style had dated this 2001 GameCube release, but the game is nicer looking than I remembered. The textures are flat, but they're not as stretched out as I remember, and the water is very beautiful, as it is for most, if not all, first-party GameCube titles. But the most striking image in the game is the vast shoreline in Forest of Hope being bathed by the golden light of sunset, with that same light refracting off the lake. It's lovely and quite iconic. Speaking of iconicism, while I was actually failing to recollect any specifics about Pikmin's three main levels, with the exception of the second, I would say at least 2 out of 3 of them are very memorable in their design and structure. Forest of Hope's design was such a sharp rebuke of Pikmin 4's open level design, having so much intent built into it by the developer that the player might eventually uncover. It was also built in a way to create variable pacing, with the center area being quite vast and full of easy resources, whereas the perimeters are narrow canyons filled with enemies and obstructions. Then there's the forest navel, whose concentric design requires breakout and expansion and encourages a multi-pronged approach to achieve these things. It has also got that unique, lazy banjo arrangement to make it interesting to listen to. Third area also has some good stuff going on too, but I can't talk about everything here. But what I definitely want to talk about is the game's soft gating. As opposed to Metroid or Zelda, which put metaphorical locked doors in front of you that require metaphorical keys to bypass, Pikmin's obstacles are more negotiable than this cut and dry approach, allowing tasks to be accomplished a number of ways, and obstacles to be bypassed rather than taken head on. Aside from the instances and situations that require a certain Pikmin type, of course. Nintendo's newer games have also opted for this more negotiable approach, but it's not nearly as compelling for one simple reason. Pikmin's soft gates are hard soft gates. For one, each level is a gauntlet of enemies that will devastate your Pikmin if they happen upon them. There's also hazards like flame spouts that, while not impossible to traverse with blue or yellow Pikmin, are better left to the reds. Then there's water. There's complaints about blue Pikmin being less useful in later games, but the reason they're useful in Pikmin 1 is because the bad pathfinding will put the other two types into a watery grave without fail. Overall, while it's not mandated to kill every enemy, nor impossible to work around hazards, Pikmin punishes carelessness, just as it punishes failure to anticipate disaster. There was a great instance in this playthrough wherein, realizing I could throw my Pikmin up onto a high ledge in Forest of Hope, I feel like I'm saying that weird. In Forest of Hope, thereby bypassing a pool of water, I was able to access all the level's explosives without detection, as all the bulborbs were facing the wrong direction, which proved highly fatal for them. I killed all of them in the perimeter canyon without taking losses. I then approached the plateau, where the trio of snag rats dwell, to engage in a foreseen bloodbath, but not before sending some Pikmin away with their bulborb prizes. Unfortunately, I had forgotten to kill the bulborb, on the shoreline guarding the standard canyon entrance. And so it went that he happened upon my Pikmin crews with their loots. He happened upon my Pikmin crews with their loot, and he annihilated the 10 on the first bulborb, but fate smiled on the second crew, as once the bulborb gobbled 3 of them, the entrance jammed up with not just their bulborb and the other bulborb, but also a third bulborb that I had neglected to pick up. So, as I'm coming back down the hill with my ship part, I see these 7 Pikmin pulling in vain at their prize, which is in the middle of the dead bulborb logjam, with one living bulborb pushing against it desperately, trying to get to these little morsels of mine. Story ends with this large procession of Pikmin and their spoils outrunning the sunset as night falls, which is the quintessential Pikmin moment that I live for. It's like a Roman triumph, and only Pikmin has it, of all games. But despite very much enjoying this game, after a long after a long stint without such a feeling. The game is quite flawed in both its basic gameplay and in the way it hops back and forth across the line between necessary challenge and abject dickishness. That second statement might be necessary to the game's difficulty balancing, and therefore could be argued as not a flaw. But there's no defending the dreadful pathfinding that leaves your Pikmin stuck on corners, stuck under bridges, drowning, or awaiting whatever other terrible fate there is. The fact that it seems almost impossible to cross a wide bridge with a fully intact Pikmin squad says it all. Throw in the Pikmin tripping or actively deserting the squad for nectar, and that there's no way to effectively select Pikmin types when throwing on the move as they morph into one another. It's very rough, to say the least. And yet, I would choose these shortcomings over 4s without hesitation. Because while you can never fix them outright, you can account for them in a way that mitigates their effect. Mostly. Which feels appropriate to the game concept and proves that I was growing and progressing with the experience. As for 4, its auto-aim ensures that there is no progression between the gameplay and the player, as that would be inaccessible and might make someone put down the controller, and modern Nintendo can't have that. Thus, you're stuck with the suck. But that's all I'll talk about with Pikmin. Next, we'll talk about Mischief Makers. So, to review Mischief Makers, which to those not in the know, this is but one review in a series of reviews covering the N64. That is the N64 software library. And as such, upon conclusion of this review, Mischief Makers will be subjected to comparison against previously reviewed N64 titles, and then ranked according to that comparison, as has been the case since the podcast's inception. So, Mischief Makers. Launched in America on October 1st, 1997, just a month or two prior to Diddy Kong Racing, purportedly developed by a 12-man team at Treasure with Hideyuki Suganami as director and Masato Meigawa and Norio Hansawa as programmer and composer, respectively. Never heard of these people in my life, just thought I'd give them their dues. Pedigree and release notwithstanding, what is Mischief Makers? It is a 2D action arcade platformer with occasional digressions into exploration gameplay. Your player character, Marina, is a spry little monkey Using just the D-pad and A and B buttons, she can dash, hover, roll, super dash / dash jump, and hover as well, which I've already said, even so. But the big mechanic is the grab, which also doubles as a block in some cases. But for most cases, Marina can grab anything not bolted down, such as clan balls, which I'll explain those, NPCs, bombs, flowers off the ground, throwing stars currently whirling towards her. In that vein also, missiles and laser beams. She's just got a penchant for grabbing things. She can also shake that which she has grabbed, which just as often as not is required for the progression, and is also accompanied by a cute little soundbite whenever done. So it is important to shake things. Getting into the controls a little more yet, I didn't actually get on all that well with them initially, nor did I entirely understand how to progress through some of the levels. And this was after reading through the manual, which is required reading for these older games. It was not that the game's controls were horribly flawed, more that they go against some of my reflexes. Like when you grab onto clan balls, which are the ghost face balls floating in the air, you jump off of them with the grab button instead of the jump button. Or there's the amount of double taps on the D-pad and A button to pull off other moves. It is all a bit fiddly, which reviews at the time of its release made mention of. But on the flip side, the game provides lots of good movement options. Going a bit broader on the game's design, I am not crazy about the ranking system built into each level. It is all standard fare as far as I understand it, but when games front load the experience with this score chasing arcade element, it puts me off for two main reasons. The first being that it's presumptuous that a game I just started playing throws what are essentially post-game pursuits right in my face, as if I am eager to sink that much time into a game I just started. And reason number two, it makes me think that the experience is more balanced and paced around the score chasing experience than it is around the linear run through, which is a similar problem I have with the Yoshi's Island games. Yoshi's Islands games. It's hard to say. Particularly Woolly World, where if you are not playing it as a completionist, the finer points of its design do not come across. But to play it as a completionist makes a 9-hour-long game 40 hours long, which the game was not good enough for that time investment. Of course, I am being very hypothetical, and my dislike towards arcade overtures in a game does not negatively impact my appraisal of it, as it is perfectly acceptable for the developer to be forthcoming about such underlying mechanisms, especially when there are people who are actively drawn in by such arcade elements. But to dwell on this a moment longer, Pikmin, which we just previously discussed, by keeping its arcade aspirations closer to the vest, it does a good job of enticing both those who are drawn to arcade elements and those who are not. But again, none of this is a problem. I'm just explaining why I spent most of a day looking at YouTube videos while this game's title screen was looping. Not that anyone asked for an explanation about that, but that is my initial experience with it. I just couldn't get into it for a while. Anyway, I want to talk more about gameplay, but I suppose some context should be laid out. The story is Marina is an android, and her inventor is captured by these ghostly weirdos called Clancy's. That's not right, but it's close. And the planet is called Clan something. And everything is given that clan prefix. Story is unimportant and bad, like with all treasure games thus far, though unfortunately it is more in the way than it has been with the Sin and Punishment games, with more inane dialogue from the story scenes and other NPCs. But the short of it is, Marina is in a strange land where the inhabitants, have ghost faces. And the few assets used in the foreground have those same ghost faces to match. Very odd, and it makes me think that Treasure was worried about storage capacity on the cartridge, which is a legitimate worry, but I think they might be one of the only developers to underestimate the storage of the N64 and its cartridges, as the same 3 to 4 assets comprise the majority of each level, with only different backgrounds being the chief differentiator. To those not watching the video version of this review, the level geometry is essentially an array of those classic painted wood toy blocks, but with ghost faces, think Scream, on each and every one of them. It's very weird, and aside from some rare basic 3D textures, the game looks to be all pre-rendered tiles and sprites. So there's your context. Now, to talk about specific instances in gameplay that stood out, while the first world is not very good, mostly being tutorial levels or simple exploration style levels, once the game gets going with more interesting ideas, you see a lot of good stuff, such as the level where you grab onto a clan ball and give it a shake, and it turns into a Blockman robot that walks left and right, crouches or stands tall, all depending how you shake it. Or there's the time when you are riding zip lines over lava, and on those zip lines, you grab onto clan springs, which can shoot Marina 100 feet laterally if compressed, and you do so as needed. There is a level where you are riding a giant missile, and whether you are positioned on its tail or on its nose determines its trajectory, with the goal being to keep it from exploding as you thread the needle through oncoming fire and other obstacles. Other times, it's the classic ho ho ho, now I've got a machine gun development. And then there's the tried and true race to the finish levels. One featuring exploding blocks over lava, and the other forcing you to ride a tricycle at speed as a tidal wave wipes out the level. In that latter example, you can't jump on the trike, so you need to speed to get air off the takeoff ramps. I did not beat that level. That is as far as I saw in the game. There is some less exciting levels too, like the levels where you return the children to that one couple, And in one of those, you fight the same 3 mini bosses in a total of 7 bouts. There's also the clan pot levels, where you catch ghosts or mix items to create something like a bomb. Those levels are both slow and confusing. There is the track and field level, which is long, puzzling, and dull, with lots of downtime between the 7 or so events. Not the worst thing ever, but not great. Interestingly, the 2 save files on my cartridge, which I was seemingly unable to erase, both were stopped on that level, meaning that me and at least 2 other people thought it was a buzzkill. Overall, the quality of the levels was more positive than negative, with only a dozen subpar ones, if you include the first world. Add to that the very enjoyable movement options. There's not too much to complain about. But there's a little more still. As far as the controls go, one of the problems with them is that you are using the N64 controller's D-pad, which for 99% of the N64 library, that D-pad is not a factor. But in the special case of Mischief Makers, I realized that the D-pad is kind of mushy, leading to inputs that either do not register or are delayed. This leads to moments where Marina drops items rather than throwing them, or in the case of the aforementioned trike level, can lead to an inexplicable loss in momentum, despite the fact that I was hammering the D-pad. The bigger problem with the controls, though, is the input method, which particularly concerns the dash run. Sometimes in platformers, you might find yourself inching towards the edge of a platform to ensure maximum distance, or you may be making quick micro adjustments in the air as you are landing. But doing so in Mischief Makers can see Marina dash off the ledge or dash in the air to overshoot the landing, and then she promptly dies. These things happen should you press the D-pad too quickly. It's not the end of the world, but it is messy and was a recurring issue throughout. Springing back to the positive, it is a treasure game, so you better believe there's some good bosses. In fact, almost all of them are good, whether they are minis or mains. They are fast-paced, challenging, and not mired down by invincibility frames. Granted, I never saw all of them. The one I really like was where you catch the big alligator's fist and throw it back into his face. Or, if you are wise, throw it into the floating wizard alligator so that he might die first, because he heals the bigger alligator. So kill the healer first, naturally. There is also the chase fight where Marina is riding the cat, which is a lot of nice spectacle, though it has the problem of there being too much going on, particularly in the first phase where the boss is shooting missiles, bullets, both wave and beam attacks, almost all at the same time, forcing Marina to defend and evade with no good options to counterattack. It's one of those non-specific attention bullet hell fights where in this specific case, it felt like my character moved too slowly and imprecisely to be effective in those conditions. Whether it be times where I went to catch a missile to throw back and ended up riding the missile, which messed up my flow, or jumped for one of the high ones, but was left vulnerable on my descent to an energy wave that the boss shoots out, with little warning. Or in the third phase, when the boss dismounts and it goes to the foreground, and there's no indication if he's going to dash kick or a somersault kick. So jumping over him is a gamble, but waiting for him to close leaves little time to avoid the dash kick or a possible uppercut. So as cool as that boss is, it is very much an attrition fight almost. But that being said, if the developer were to fix that sort of boss, they would overfix it. And it would be tame and dull. So being clear, it might be a touch too hard, but the best solution is to get good. So what I'm saying is, the bosses I played were the highlight of the game, as that concept of grabbing and throwing felt at its strongest, and the ones I didn't take on seemed to carry on that trend. So good stuff with the bosses, maybe even great. One last thing to talk about before we conclude, and I'm going to try to keep it short, but it's the game's biggest flaw. The game is ugly. It also doesn't sound that good, but mostly it is ugly, both in technical terms and graphical terms. I have already talked about the game's Clancer look, and it's, in a word, lame. And someone might say, hey, that's like your opinion, man. I know that. But when a game's levels are made out of toy blocks with faces on them, I will go ahead and say we have found the artistic anomaly that everyone can say is objectively bad. Now, if it was just one level, it would be subverting and interesting, but it's the through line of the visuals, and it sucks. Technically speaking, it is maybe worse. The first world has this orchard background, but it looks like it only half rendered in, leaving everything blurry and pixelated. And then there's the fire temple background, which looks washed out and stretched. The sunset on the snowy mountain background looks fine, but the midground is still made of toy blocks, so it is not much of a victory. The character sprites do not look good either. Marina and the professor look particularly crude, and the other sprites, such as the bosses, they look fine at a distance, and during the boss fights, they do some crowd-pleasing antics, like zooms, rotations, and stretches on them. But whenever the camera pans in on them and holds there, they do not look so hot. Very crude. So, as an exercise, compare it to Yoshi's Story. There are people who find the Donkey Kong Country trilogy. My script is completely all whack here, sorry, but we're not doing edits. We're going to leave this in. There are people who find the Donkey Kong Country trilogy very dated by its pre-rendered graphics. I am not such a people, but this game would be tarred and feathered by such people, and I wouldn't say boo about it. Honestly, I would like Mischief makers more with Pong graphics, were that possible. Which is all I will say about it. Though I am confused that it has not been spoken on more. Also, the music is forgettable arcade music with a very hollow timbre. not great. And as I previously mentioned, as an exercise compared to Yoshi's Story, Yoshi's Story is also pre-rendered on the N64, and it looks really great and really clear, and the music's also pretty good. It's not a great game, Yoshi's Story, but it makes pre-rendered graphics look a lot better than this game does. So that's all I'll say. Now, to conclude with my summary statement, this is obviously not my sort of game. Nevertheless, it is apparent that the game has strong gameplay elements, which are utilized well within some very creative level design. Unfortunately, this is one of the ugliest games I have reviewed, placed alongside Mario Tennis and... Actually, those two might have the category to themselves. So where does that leave this game on the review scale? The temptation is to give it a 7 and call it a day. But I resent the notion that my 7 out of 10s are not more than a participation ribbon. Because a 7 out of 10 is a truly good game by my best estimations, and a game doesn't just get one slapped onto its box. It needs to be earned, and given the lousy audio visuals of Mischief Makers, alongside my complaints about its lesser levels and its fiddly controls, I would not place it higher than 6.5 out of 10. Meaning that, as a game, it's fun. Quite fun, even. And for many people, they see this game as a hidden gem on the N64. Which, there's plenty of games on the N64 that people consider to be hidden gems. And I would not call them that. Maybe just because the N64 has such a small library, people over-appraise some of these lesser, fine-ish games. But for Mischief Makers, I would understand if somebody who was really into arcade games really latched onto it. But that doesn't change the fact that the game is very horrendous to look at, and the controls are just kind of odd. It's not a matter of preference. There's flaws in them. There's fiddliness in them, which, if you're a great gamer, you can mitigate all that. But there's definitely better choices they could have made in that regard. So, I mean, is it a hidden gem on the N64? I don't really know if I'd give it that. I wouldn't say I'm necessarily disappointed in the game, because I was always kind of... what would be the word? Suspicious of it, or unsure that it would be my kind of game. And I was correct on that notion. But that's not why it's getting a lower score. It's got its problems, which I mentioned. And if you agree or disagree about those problems in my review, write it down in the comments or send me an email at nalistenerq@gmail.com. That is nalistenerq@gmail.com. With that said, we'll go to rankings now after some music. All right, let's rank this bad boy. Starting off with the 6.5 categories, as is fitting. Is Mischief Makers better than Perfect Dark? Which, again, also got a 6.5 out of 10. So, to those not in the know, we compared these games to the games that scored the same numerical value. So, is Mischief Makers better than Perfect Dark? I would say it is. Perfect Dark has a pretty fun multiplayer that you can definitely get into, but the story mode of Perfect Dark is such a step down from GoldenEye, and GoldenEye's campaign mode wasn't perfect by any means either, but Perfect Dark's story design, and by story design I mean like the campaign design, the single player, it is asinine in so many areas, in areas that GoldenEye was asinine, but then even going beyond that. So yeah, the story doesn't really compare to Mischief Makers. Very interesting levels, at least the levels that are interesting. As for multiplayer, I mean, you could probably make a case for Perfect Dark being better on the basis of its multiplayer, but the thing about Perfect Dark's multiplayer is it is good, but it's not this incredible thing. You can find much better multiplayers with much more conventional controls anywhere else. Play Nightfire on the PS2 or GameCube. There's an example. Or, well, really, that's my go-to example. That probably Time Splitters, another example. So I would say that, I think Mischief Makers inches out Perfect Dark. Because, yeah, the multiplayer mode is good in Perfect Dark, but it's not incredible. And when I say it's good, I mean it's very okay. I mean, given those weird controls, because the N64 really couldn't do good first-person controls. Yeah, Mischief Makers edges out Perfect Dark. Is Mischief Makers better than Turok 2? Oh boy. Oh. Speaking of bad first-person shooter controls, Turok 2 is pretty lousy. If we're talking about Turok 2 on the PC, which that version you can play on the Xbox One now, and I would highly recommend doing that. Turok 2 is a very good game, but on the N64, those controls are something else. But let's say you could wrestle with those controls and get to the point where they are functional, and given also the generous audio aim, you could make that adventure work. I would say Turok 2's core design is a lot stronger, core level design that is a lot stronger than what Mischief Makers has going on. And it's also, talking about audio visuals, Turok 2 is a much better looking game than Mischief Makers, pardon me. As is Perfect Dark, which, gosh, maybe I should have thought of that. Even so, Perfect Dark isn't as good as Mischief Makers. But Turok 2, great looking game, and the controls are going to be a huge barrier. And in that sense, Mischief Makers controls are much better than Turok 2's, but getting good enough with Turok 2's controls, you'll have a much more satisfying experience. Even though I never got to that point with Turok 2's controls. I only played the N64 version for maybe 2 hours, which you think isn't a lot, but seeing as I played Turok 3 all the way to the end with those same controls and never was able to wrangle them, yeah, those controls are going to be quite the hurdle. Even so, with the audio visuals and the level design of Turok 2, and its lousy controls to bring it all down, I think it might be a stronger game than Mischief Makers, ever so slightly. Even though, you know, how a game controls, and if you can control the game, is maybe one of the most important aspects of a game, and Turok's controls essentially break that experience. I'm going to say Turok 2 still edges out Mischief Makers. Yeah, it still does. Well, no, I have it written down that Turok 2 is better than Mischief Makers. Turok 2 is better than Mischief Makers because while the controls aren't very good, you can still play the game somewhat effectively with the controls, even though you'll be gritting your teeth through it. Turok 2, slightly better than Mischief Makers, just because of its great level design and large world design. So that's where Mischief Makers will stay in its ascension. It has stopped ascending, really. All right, so with that ranking out of the way, we are going to rattle off the list in a ascending order. At number 36, we have Conker's Bad Fur Day, or number 37, rather. At 36, we have Turok 3. At 35, Banjo-Tooie. At 34, Bomberman Hero. At 33, 007, The World Is Not Enough. At 32, Turok, the original. At 31, we have Super Mario Party 2. At 30, Donkey Kong 64. At 29, Jet Force Gemini. At 28, Yoshi's Story. At 27, Shadows of the Empire. At 26, Perfect Dark. At 25, Mischief Makers. At 24, Turok 2. At 23, Extreme G. At 21, Beetle Adventure Racing. At 20, I can already see I've screwed up the list. Whatever. At 20, we have Battle for Naboo. At number... Oh boy. I'm so mad. Technically, we are at 18, and you'll just have to account for that. At number 18, we have 007 GoldenEye. At number 17, we have Sin and Punishment. At 16, we have Mario Tennis. At 15, Doom 64. At 14, Mario Kart 64. I have another game on this list that shouldn't be here yet, so actually this is number 12, even though it says number 13. At number 12, we have Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. I think that's the title of it. It's kind of a tricky title. That's number 12. At 11, we have Pilot Wing 64. At number 10, we have Super Smash Brothers. At 9, Kirby 64. At 8, Wave Race 64. At 7, Rogue Squadron. At 6, Star Fox 64. At number 5, F-Zero X. At number 4, Diddy Kong Racing. At number 3, Banjo-Kazooie. At number 2, Ocarina of Time, The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, to be more formal. And taking the top, we have Super Mario 64. So that is my list, which I flubbed a few times there, but try to follow as best as you can. So that will do it for the show. As I said, the email address is nalistenerq@gmail.com should you want to reach out. Should you not be sending emails or comments, though, I appreciate you listening, and stay tuned for more reviews on the N64 and other consoles going forward, Lord willing. So, that's it for the show. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it, and have a God bless day.